So we are ready for session 5 tonight. Tu es l'étu is our title. That's a French phrase issued by a Catholic bishop during the Crusades. When a soldier asked what he should do if he could not tell the difference between a Muslim, a Jew, or a Christian when he got to the Holy Land, and the bishop, it translates, kill them all. And a second line was added, God will know his own. Kill them all, God will know his own. And it's one of the most violent periods in Christian history, and it's where and how European powers learned to colonize far and distant lands. And further still, lines were drawn in the Middle East during this period that remain in place today in many ways. And the upheaval of the last century in the Middle East could be seen as, a retrograde return to some old Crusader hostilities. And it's hard to, as I've said many times this session, it's hard to speak of the past. It's not the past, it's the present. And it is still actively present. I won't be one-sided. On both sides of the Crusades, this phrase, kill them all, was used by both Christians and Muslims, as the two groups waged war for about 250 years. And then it was then used amongst Catholics and Protestants during the Reformation. And then it was used again by some of the magisterial reformers and during the 100 Years' War as well between England and France. If you can't tell, get them all. God will know his own. So this is the shortest time span that we'll cover in these weeks, but what happened in these 2 centuries, 1,000 years ago, will continue to shape the 21st century. In this last century, the previous century, we survived 2 world wars, 2 atomic explosions. Enemies have made peace on the back side of that, but what began in the Crusades is ongoing. And at the outset, maybe we should revisit the issue of just war. We talked about it last week and compared the concepts of just war with just jihad. And these are principles that are in place in each religion. In Christianity says, and this goes back to Augustine, so we're 500 years before the Crusades, Christians were already wrestling with, what are the rules of engagement? Because for the first 300 years of Christianity was nonviolent, and it was not associated with the state. So then there was a struggle about when is it just? And Christianity and later Islam all came to these 4 solid conclusions. The cause must be just. It must be the war must be declared only by a legitimate power. The end must be obtainable, and the ultimate goal must be peace. And then we leap to the High Middle Ages to Thomas Aquinas in the 1200s. What's really interesting is Aquinas' ethic of just war comes after the Crusades. So his interpretations are shaped by those 200 years of war that Europe had been engaged in the Middle East. And he adds 3 additional standards to the ethic of just war. Number 1, war must be the last resort. Keep talking as long as possible. Number 2, the good sought must outweigh the evil inflicted. Aquinas was of the persuasion that all war is evil. It might be a necessary evil, but it is evil. And whatever you engage in, the good must outweigh the evil. And then the third addition, non-combatants must be protected. Again, these are the direct reflections of Aquinas following the centuries of watching so much war. And Aquinas' voice can be heard to this day in the Geneva Conventions. The Geneva Convention was the great passing of protections adopted by the global community after World War II to protect soldiers, to protect civilians, to in some ways iron out rules of engagements, again, because so much atrocity had been seen and so much atrocity had been committed. And there had to be a way to say, can we reset this? It's really interesting that, a man from the Middle Ages, that his just war theory, all the way back to Augustine, that language is in our vocabulary still today. It's not that we practice it, because not everybody, although everybody says we'll play by these rules, not everybody does. And they're certainly open to but to interpretation. Like the end must be attainable. But what is the end that we're actually after here? And have we really exhausted to the last resort? So there's a lot of debate, ethical debate that can be had here. And certainly these last three editions, Aquinas' editions, were not at play in the Crusades at all. War was not a last resort. It was often for greed, for money, for land. The good sought was hardly ever considered, and non-combatants were not protected. You'll see as we talk tonight about the Crusades that if they occurred today, men like the heroic King Richard the Lionheart and the heroic Saladin, Sultan Saladin, would have been tried on war crimes when it was over because of the number of civilians that were just indiscriminately wiped out. So we'll talk about some of that tonight. But let's talk about how we got to this place that the Crusades break out. So in 637 A.D., Jerusalem is taken peacefully by Umar the Great. He's one of the Islamic Caliphate leaders. He's the third caliphate, so he's only two after Muhammad. And it's a conquest, but it's not violent, because neither Rome nor the Byzantines had any army to meet the Arabian army that was coming from the south. And so they marched into Jerusalem. They granted freedom of expression and freedom to worship to Jews and to Christians. And for about 4 centuries, Muslims and Jews and Christians got along together in the city of Jerusalem. 4 centuries. So if you visit Jerusalem today, and I miss Jerusalem, but if you go there, it's still divided into 4 quarters. And the roots of that division go all the way back to the 600s and 700s. You know, the Muslim quarter is over there, Christian quarter is over there, the Jewish quarter is over there, and the Armenian quarter, the Armenian, Turkish, Byzantine corner is over here. So that has been long established within the old city of Jerusalem itself. So Jerusalem is just kind of moving along. It's under the control of the Islamic Caliphate. In 1054, you might remember that tensions between East and West get to a point that the Roman Catholic Church excommunicated the Patriarch of Constantinople, and the Patriarch of Constantinople returned the favor. And that is the beginning of Greek, Russian, Ukrainian Orthodoxy, all the Orthodox churches, and Roman Catholicism. The Roman Church, this is an unfortunate economic outcome of a theological battle, is that when the church divided, all Christians and churches inside the Holy Land then fell under the jurisdiction of Constantinople. And Rome lost the pilgrimage dollars of taking Europeans to the Holy Land to see the holy sites. Because now that they were split, Constantinople said, nope, you're not allowed in anymore. So that was a pretty big economic loss. If you go to the slide, Garrett, in 1073, the Seljuk Turks captured Jerusalem from Syrian Muslims. Now, the Seljuks are Turkish, the first Turks. And they come, I don't know if you can see it on here. Do you see the Ural Sea? It's the body of water at the very top. There's the Caspian Sea, and then to the right of it and to further north, the Suljaks come from this area. They're more Mongol than Arabian. They're fast fighters. They're cavalry fighters. They're aggressive, and you see all the land that they took, and they gave their name, the Turk name, to Asia Minor, Turkey, still to this day. And they rooted themselves there, and they go all the way down and take Jerusalem. And when they do that, a lot of tension arises. And do you have that map on your page as well? Look at that map, and you see where Constantinople is. The Turks roll right up to the capital city of Greek Christianity. The barbarians are at the gates, so to speak. And they may have overrun Constantinople at the time, but in 1090 or so, 1095, the Shah of that group dies suddenly. And when he dies, his heirs sort of divide up ruling the big kingdom. They weren't really interested in one person ruling it all, so the sons all say, I'll take this territory, you take that territory. And this little crack opened at that point for the Patriarch of Constantinople, just 50 years after their schism, asked Rome for military assistance to push the Turks back out of the Middle East. This is the beginning of the Crusade movement. The Eastern Church had plenty of money, and they didn't have enough soldiers. Europe had plenty of soldiers, didn't have any money, because Europe is in a feudal system. So it's all about kings and lords and knights in shining armor. And all these knights are spending all their time in war games and just killing each other. So maybe we could consolidate and kill a common enemy. And this begins the roots of the Crusade movement. Was there a question? Okay, very good. Thank you for your interruption, and it was properly received. Pope Urban II is the one who makes the appeal. He answers Constantinople's ask for help. They make the request like in 1090, 1094 in that area. In 1095, he gives a stirring sermon, but here is why really what he did. He saw in his mind, this isn't this great warring cause for the sake of Christianity. It was a power grab. Remember, the church has only been divided for a generation. And he thought, I can get it all back. I'll go over there and help, but I'll get it all back under the Roman church. So these were his motivations. Number one, I'll unite the warring factions of Europe behind my command. Again, all these knights are killing each other. There are hundreds of lords and lesser lords and a few kings. The European nation state has not emerged at this point. Number two, usurping Byzantine influence. That's the Eastern Church. He wanted to be in charge of that. Three, creating crusader states in the Holy Land. His thoughts were, we'll go take some of this land and we'll get our pilgrimage rights back. We'll have forward bases of operation in the Middle East. That becomes very, very important. And then number four, using a reward scheme of motivation. He said to the kings and to the lords, hey, you go take an army over there and we'll just carve it up. How much land do you need? And so it was sort of this plantation scheme. Whatever your armies loot, it's yours as long as you tithe on it. And then he gave an absolution of sins, immediate entry into heaven upon death and service in the crusade. That is not original with Islam. You know, I commit murder in the name of Allah and I'm going to go to paradise when I die. That did not come from Muhammad. It came from the Pope, Urban II, as a motivating factor. If you die in the service to the church, immediate entry into heaven, no need to be baptized, no need to make final confession, you're in. I don't think you have it on your page, but I want you to listen. This is text from Urban's sermon. It's very small, so if you want to just listen, this is what he said. Your brethren who live in the East are in urgent need of your help, and you must hasten to give them aid. The Turks and Arabs have attacked them and have conquered the territory of the Mediterranean. They have destroyed the churches and devastated the empire. Of holy Jerusalem, which Christ himself suffered for us because our sins demanded it, has been reduced to the pollution of paganism. Eyes have seen the abominations to which it has been given over. The dead bodies of God's servants have been given to be food. He's quoting the book of Revelation and Isaiah and Ezekiel here. Have been given over for the birds of heaven, the flesh of the saints, and to the beasts of the earth. Their blood have they shed like water round about Jerusalem, and there was none to bury them. I'll stop right there. He's reading these apocalyptic scriptures at the turn of the millennium, telling people as well in additional sermons that the apocalypse is now upon us and the book of Revelation is being fulfilled. On this account I beseech all ye people of whatever rank, foot soldiers and knights, poor and rich, to carry aid promptly to those Christians and to destroy that vile race from the land. Oh, what a disgrace if such a despised and base race which worships demons should conquer a people which has the faith of omnipotent God. The holy sepulchre of the Lord our Savior is possessed by unclean nations, polluted now with their filthiness. The Lord will overwhelm us if you do not aid those who profess the Christian religion. Let the deeds of your ancestors move you. Remember this guy? The glory and greatness of Charlemagne and of his sons who destroyed the pagans and have extended the territory of the Holy Church. You should shudder, brethren, you should shudder at raising a violent hand against Christians. But to brandish your sword against these Turks, this is the only warfare that is righteous. All who die by the way, whether by land or by sea, or in battle against the pagans, shall have immediate remissions of sins. This I grant them through the power of God with which I am invested. And the possessions of the enemy too will be yours, since you will make spoil of their treasures and return victorious to your own. And let this be your war cry in combat, because this word is given to you by God. When an armed attack is made upon your enemy, let this one cry be raised by all the soldiers of God. It is the will of God. It is the will of God. Not a high moral or ethical point in Christian history. And it worked. The Crusades were launched with that sermon. Out of France, the Franks and the Germans, and later the Brits and the English and the Italians, all of Europe. But that was the coronating speech. We still have it, and we have many of Urban's sermons. He gives this one in 1095 or so. He would not live to see Jerusalem liberated. It would be liberated by Christians in 1099, but he would die before those events. Questions? How many crusades were there? 7 or 8. Some say 9. It worked till it didn't work. And we'll get to why it didn't work. And I can go ahead and tell you, it stopped working when mothers and fathers said, we're not giving you our sons anymore. 250 years of giving our sons over to the church, and we've lost everything we were fighting for. And we have moral dilemmas, and we should in this country. Vietnam, the war in the Middle East, that can go for decades, and we say, what's 250 years of successive waves of madness. Of madness. If they had not succeeded in the first one, it may not have gone that way. But they succeeded gloriously, blood and honor, in the first one. And so there was always the hope that we can get back to that glory going on after that. Other questions? Well, let's look at the timeline, and you have this as well. And the First Crusade's 1095, the second 1147, the third 1189, the fourth and fifth over 20 years in the early 1200s, the sixth and the seventh 1258, 1254. This is about the time Aquinas comes on the scene to start clarifying just war. And then the 8th and 9th Crusades all the way up to 1272. And really you can go all the way to 1290. That's when the last Crusader hold, all the way to 1300 essentially. That's when the last Crusader hold in the Holy Land fell. And all the Europeans were expelled. By the time you get to the Third Crusade, and we're going to highlight points of some of these, all the royal families of England are involved. King Philip, King Richard, King Edward, King Carlos, Germany, all of them get in on the action. You can see by the just the listing here of how they fared. The first one, an attempt to capture Jerusalem, was a success. The second, to recapture Odessa that had been lost, failed. The third attempt to recapture Jerusalem failed. Fourth, attempted Egyptian offensive failed. Attempted Egyptian offensive again as the fifth, failure. Sixth, attempt to gain access to holy sites in Jerusalem. It was a success. Very little fighting was done. Once the armies arrived, they sat down and negotiated. Seventh, attempted Egyptian offensive, failed. 8, attempted Tunisian offensive in North Africa, failed. And 9, the final defense of Acre as it's called, it failed as well. So some key events that you have. We'll talk about the First Crusade, obviously, first. Byzantine's request for a few specialized soldiers is answered with 60,000 soldiers and peasants coming out of Europe to go to Jerusalem. Only 15,000 make it. So at the very outset, tens of thousands of people starved to death on the way to the Holy Land. They show up in Constantinople. They are hungry. They are beleaguered. They are demanding. The Byzantine emperor at the time, who had asked for help, won't even let them in the town because they were so brutish. They were fanatics. And both the Byzantines and the Muslims in this area, when the first Crusaders arrived, thought that they were literally insane, uneducated, religious piety that you would not believe. The Pope didn't go. He gives the fiery sermon, then goes back to the Vatican. But there was a guy called Peter the Hermit who was on this first crusade, and he was a powerful preacher. And he was convinced that it was the will of God. And every time spirits would get down, he'd whip them up. And he made the entire journey all the way into Jerusalem. The Muslims of the Holy Land were caught off guard by this invasion, and they could not really marshal a defense because of the death of the Shah. And so Jerusalem falls to the Frankish army, the French, 2 brothers, Godfrey and Baldwin, and a Norman prince named Bohemond, and the city returned to Christian hands for the first time in 4 centuries. The Crusaders were referred to usually as the Franks, the French. There is I'll say that in a minute. They established 4 Crusader states, territories. The county of Odessa, the Principality of Antioch, the county of Tripoli, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem. So all these territories are ruled by different European powers. This was the promise. So you have the French largely have the King of Jerusalem. Another Frenchman has Tripoli. Antioch belongs to the Normans, so on and so forth. And this is how they take their stand. The First Crusade was marked by tremendous Christian atrocity of what would be called war crimes today. At Antioch, when Antioch was taken, maybe 7,000 Jews and Muslims were slaughtered, the civilians of the town. At Ma'at el-Aman, 10,000 men, women, and children were killed. This was in the county of Odessa. And they were not only killed, I will read for you. Our troops boiled the pagan adults alive in cooking pots. They impaled them on spits, and we devoured them grilled. In Jerusalem, the dead were piled outside the city as high as houses. Jews, Christians, Muslims, up to 30,000 were killed in the battles for Jerusalem. And no such cruelty had ever been inflicted by Christians, Muslims, or Jews at any point in history like those first atrocities. It was new and it was monstrous. And then it was returned in kind when the Muslims got the upper hand. They took their vengeance. Not in the name of religion. Not in the name of religion. Alexander, absolutely in his name. And the Romans could just obliterate. The Romans decimated Israel to the point of that it barely survived. Tens of thousands, but never in the name of religion. This is the first. People said, religious wars have killed more people than anybody. That's really not true. But in this case, it was the motivating factor for the bloodshed. Odessa was taken by the Turk warrior Zengi in 1144. He retaliated against these atrocities. He killed 30,000 Christians. And he is the one who resurrected the word jihad and used it for the first time in a purely holy war sense. So even that word has its origins in the crusade movement. He made it a holy war. Questions? Now, if you find that shocking, we don't teach this in the United States. Our wars are the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Korea. That's what's in our history books. We don't study the Crusades unless you're in advanced Western civilization, your junior or senior year of college, and you're a history major or something like that. You might get to that. You need to know, though, if you are a Muslim student in Europe or in Asia or the Middle East in college, you hear every bit of this because this is their Revolutionary War. So, folks of the Islam faith are much more familiar with what happened in the Crusades than we are, protected so far away in the West. And it should shock us. It should shock us. Questions? I'm going to jump to the Third Crusade. The second one was, so we'll get to the third one. Yes?
What happened between the Crusades? Like they didn't start and then they went back home?
Now, sometimes, good question. The question is, what happened between those Crusades? Garrett, can you go back to the four territories? So you see all the area that they ruled and had. This area would advance and retreat. So these were movable lines. So they would go establish themselves, and if somebody kind of wrenched all the money they could out of a location, that's it for me, boys, I'm gone. They're mercenaries, and they'd get on a boat and leave. Well, obviously, when that would happen, then the Islamic armies would begin to come back. By the time the Crusades and the Crusaders fall, they're pushed all the way to the coast. They hold no major city, they just hold castles at the coast. And so some stayed, some children were born there as citizens of their home country abroad, but they were born there and lived their whole lives there. Sometimes in relative peace, and then there are other times of just constant warfare. So there's a lot of give and take. You have the emergence of the Hospitallers and the Knights Templar during this time period that simply rode the roads to protect pilgrims. They were like mobile special forces out and about. We'll talk about them in a little bit as well. And so it just depended on who was in charge and exactly what time period you were in. It wasn't just constant bloodshed. There'd be waves of war. Like the Fourth and Fifth Crusade was 20 years of war. 20 years of constant. And you think of Iraq today or Afghanistan. It's not like the war. It's not like the World War where you'd put 100,000 men in a at the Battle of the Bulge and fight it out. A pocket there, a hilltop over here, a skirmish over there. Real bloodshed, real fighting, but in much more isolated ways. Well, they ran right together. For example, you'll have the fourth one that would be led by a Turkish lord. A Frankish or a French lord. He expends his resources. He sends word back and says, I'm going to fail. And so an English king would say, I'm on my way, and bring the fifth army. in succession after different armies. There's rarely the First Crusade, the Third Crusade. There are consolidated forces. The other ones, there are waves, some big, some small, landing on the shores, reinforcements falling back, and that's one of the reasons they were so unsuccessful. Is there's so much rivalry. The French wouldn't work with the Germans. The Germans wouldn't work with the Italians. The Italians weren't going to work with the British. It sounds familiar, yeah. It sounds, because again, for them, for the Pope, it was maybe, and for some true believers, they may have felt religious compulsion, but it's largely a land grab. It's for resources, and the glory of I liberated, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, or what have you. So it's constant. Sometimes there are phases of just guerrilla battles. The Third Crusade is the result of a bitter defeat in Jerusalem, and Europe cannot stand it that after claiming Jerusalem they've lost it, and a massive army is marshaled for that one. That's why I'm hitting just some of these highlights. John? Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 Well, and much of that is it's good rhetoric, but it's divorced from history. You don't want to champion the Crusaders very long. Number one, because of the atrocities, but man, they lost more than they won. They were handing their butt handed to them everywhere they turned, and they were. It was okay. I mean, it was in a feudal system for a German lord to go over with his vassals and his knights, and if he could squeeze out, $2 or $3 million in the 2 months he's there, and he loses his entire army, see ya. I'll go back and raise another one. That feudalism plays into all this. You would swear your allegiance, take the sign of the cross to be a crusader, then you swore your allegiance to whoever your commander was, and you died for that man, if it had to be. So the Third Crusade, there's a clash between two historical titans. King Richard I, the Lionheart of England, and Al-Nasser Saladin, a Kurdish sultan. Saladin succeeded after that First and Second Crusade to unite Egypt and Syria against the Crusaders, and he did this as a Sunni, a minority, when all of Egypt and that area were Shiite. So he's very skilled in building this coalition. July 4th, 1187, Saladin baits the Crusaders outside the city of Jerusalem and defeats them at a place called the Horns of Haddon, or the Horns of Hittim. You've seen it. You've been to Israel. You can sit at the Sea of Galilee, right where Jesus taught the Sermon on the Mount at the Church of the Beatitudes, and you can look across the lake and you'll see two mountain points in this little valley, this U shape, and those are the Horns of Hittim. And Saladin lured them out, and they were very foolish. Guy of Lizon and Reynaud, Frenchman, they come marching out with their army with the true cross of Jesus. They had brought it, out of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and that was their standard. They would put the cross out in front of them and say, with the true cross, no crusading army can lose with the true cross out in front of them. And so they march out into the desert, and they march for 2 days without water. And they get within eyesight of the Sea of Galilee where they can take a drink. And they just start stampeding toward the Sea of Galilee, and Saladin lights the desert bushes on fire and chokes them out with smoke on the third day, and then moves in and slaughters them all. Kills the entire garrison of Jerusalem. He then turns to go to Jerusalem, and he is going to return favor for favor. And he gets to the walls of Jerusalem, and he is going to kill them all. And a soldier named Balian comes out, meets Saladin, negotiates a surrender, and says, "We will give you the city of Jerusalem if you let us leave, and we'll pay a fine. But if you assault us, we will burn down every mosque, including the mosque that was over the Church of the Holy Sepulchre that had been built and rebuilt, including where the Temple Mount is today." Balian said, "We will burn it all down and you'll have nothing." And so every person was required to pay a toll, and they left. Great movie called The Kingdom of Heaven, starring a very young Orlando Bloom, about 20, 25 years ago. It's a little fast with the historical details, but it is rooted in that exact time and in the Third Crusade. It's a great movie. There's one of my favorite movie lines. The dead in Jerusalem are just stacked up, and Orlando Bloom, because all the other leaders have been massacred out at the Horns of Hittim, he says, "We got to get these bodies out." And so they're just stacking bodies up outside, and the bishop of Jerusalem comes out and says, and he's going to burn these bodies to stop disease. And the bishop says, "You can't burn these bodies. You'll send their souls to hell." Orlando Bloom's character says, "If we don't burn these bodies, we're all going to be dead in a week." And the bishop says, "Well, God's going to judge you for it." And Orlando Bloom says, "God will understand. And if God does not understand, then God is not God." It's one of the best lines in the entire movie. So there you go. So back in Europe, when this happens, Jerusalem falls. Back in Europe, Pope Gregory can't let this stand, and he tries to find a victor who will go and liberate Jerusalem. King Richard just becomes King Richard, and he is coronated, and he rises from his coronation, takes the sign of the cross, and marches on the army and marches on the Middle East. Now, for those of you that like Robin Hood, this is the stage where Robin Hood emerges in Great Britain in the absence of the king. The king's off fighting the Crusades, and the Sheriff of Nottingham is taking advantage of all the poor people back in England. Yeah, that too. Monty Python, Men in Tights, all of them. It's all going on right there. It's good. Good. So Saladin and Richard have a very interesting relationship. They have a lot of respect for one another. Richard did not succeed, by the way, in retaking Jerusalem. He did succeed in allowing Christians to come to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and to other holy sites. They fought several direct battles with each other. Two things that Saladin did that were quite noble. Richard caught malaria in the Middle East and had an extremely high fever, and Saladin sent his special forces to the top of Mount Horeb to get as much snow as they could carry, and took it to Richard to alleviate his fever with malaria. They're on the battlefield, and this is in the historical record as well, and King Richard at Acre has his horse shot from beneath him, and it collapses. And Saladin stopped the battle and had another horse taken to him so that it would be a fair fight. So they had a really interesting relationship. Another interesting thing, after King Richard leaves, Saladin gave the keys to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to the Christians, and they started killing one another over who was going to be in charge. And so Saladin picked an Iranian family to hold the keys to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And some of you have met that man. He still holds the keys today. He's like the 50th whatever ancestor of the family that Saladin chose because the Christians were killing each other. It's just madness. It's just absolutely madness. But there's a lot of some of the Crusader lore is from this Third Crusade. It's really rooted deep in British history. King Richard leaves the Crusades. This is how it was. On his way home in France, he's taken prisoner by King Philip because they they had a fight amongst themselves. It's just all this. It's like a soap opera going on at the same time. That's going to be that's actually way before. We think that Arthur is the conglomeration of when the Romans actually withdrew from Great Britain all the way back 300 A.D. that you begin to see that lore emerge from Celtic and British circles. Yeah, that's a good question. We're getting all our movies in now too. See, all our oh, good. Yeah, yeah, I'm sure. The Fourth and Fifth Crusades in 1204, armies of the Fourth Crusade organized to invade Egypt. They don't get that far. They stop in Constantinople. They're not treated as they think they should, and they sack the city. That's the picture on my right up there. It's a famous painting, the sack of Constantinople. They never made it to Egypt. There's your fourth and fifth. This one, they stopped in Constantinople, sacked the city, burned it to the ground, and made so much money in Constantinople, why go on? And they turned around and came back. About this time, the Pope started changing policy. You know, you'll get into heaven if you die in service. But if you take the sign of the cross and do that, you're just going straight to hell. Literally, to stop that sort of stuff from happening again. In the Fifth Crusade, Francis of Assisi travels to the Middle East to try to negotiate peace with the Sultan. And Sultan Malik al-Kamil. And we don't know the exact details of their conversation, but St. Francis of the Franciscans succeeded in somehow crossing enemy lines and was not killed. Here's this little friar, and they take him to the Sultan because they thought, well, he's the bearer of whatever negotiations are going on. He's like, nope, I'd like to tell you about Jesus. And so they hang out for 4 or 5 days. And the Sultan had been influenced a lot by Sufism, so he had this whole mystical side of him. And so some say that Francis walked through fire to prove that his beliefs were true. Others say that they just had theological discussions, each by the end trying to convert the other to each one's faith. But in the end, they share meals together on the last day, which no Christian or Muslim would have been doing during that time. And Francis is taking back to the crusading army in safety. It's one of those great little lore things. And I think if you go to Assisi, I've never been there. I'll get there one day. There's a little battle horn in the museum there. That's a call to battle that was a gift from the Sultan to Francis. And Francis said he would never use it to call a battle, but he would use it to call prayer. And so that's a pretty interesting story. This is a Dutch scholar, Jan Hobberix, writes, Al-Qamin had seen the worst face of Christianity, the face of invaders pressing forward, wielding the true cross like a weapon, even after a reasonable peace had been offered. Francis had shown Sultan al-Kamil what it meant to be a true Christian, a holy person who truly believed Jesus' call to love the enemy. So it's quite a contrast in the middle of all that bloodshed. So, it's always like that in Christian history. It's always like that in every era. Not everybody in Europe was saying, yep, let's go kill them all. It's never that way. There's always remnants. There's always pockets of holy resistance. And you see that. That's one of the reasons I wanted to include Francis in this, because Francis is probably one of the most revered saints in the Western world. Catholics, Protestants, the Orthodox revere him as well because of the example that he gave. And he had been a POW in one of the European wars for a year. And he had seen, when he was a young man, and he had seen the slaughter of a battlefield, and he knew what it was like to be far from home. And so his negotiation for peace was coming from his faith, but it was coming from his own experience as well. He didn't want other young men and families to go through what he had gone through. The Ninth Crusade is Christianity's last stand, if you could say it that way. If you look at the next map there, to your question earlier, Susan, all the green area by the Ninth Crusade is now under Islamic rule. And the Crusaders have been pushed all the way to the coast. And these aren't so much cities by this point, from Beirut all the way down to Jaffa. These aren't cities so much as they're castles. They're footholds where reinforcements could come in, and they just keep trying to eke back some of the land. The Ninth Crusade is a call to defend that small footprint that's left. Every battle was lost by the French army and the Crusaders during that. Christian rule, Christian occupancy comes to an end. Acre falls 20 years later in 1292. That was the last toehold. They were pushed back to Cyprus, and the Europeans would not hold in the Middle East again until post-World War I. There was a group of knights that get written into lore at that last hold, the Knights Templar. They were holding Acre to the very last man. It's about this time that you hear about them, with all their banking and shenanigans and movies about them and all sorts of things. They were by this time, they were loathed by the Muslims because they were such fierce fighters, and they were loathed by the Europeans who were tired of fighting. And they were very wealthy too. They had made a lot of money on the war business over 200 years. Questions? There's a lot of movies and shows you can find on History Channel, YouTube, everywhere about the Knights Templar. Most of it is bunk. It's just silliness. Dan Brown gets in on it too with the Da Vinci Code and those movies as well. It's really entertaining. Don't get me wrong; it's really entertaining. But they grab just enough of actual historical events. It's conspiracy theory. It's entertaining conspiracy theory. I don't think it hurts anybody. Some do, but that one doesn't. Well, let's talk quickly here at the end, and it will be quick. But this is really where the Crusades take us. Let's talk about the immediate and the long-term aftermath of the Crusades. Number one, in Europe, feudalism collapses after the Crusades, and you see the rise of nationalism. So many lords, knights, and princes died. There was literally a shortage of leadership and a lot of instability. And so you see the nation-state start to really get formed post-Crusades. Number two, technological and cultural rejuvenation. This is one positive thing about the Crusades, is that Europe got exposed to a superior culture and brought back with them farming methods, mathematics, astronomy, science, all these things that got infused back into European society and helped lay the groundwork for eventually the Renaissance after the Crusades. Number three, it galvanized Islamic resistance against Europe and Christianity to the present day. Any incursion that Muslims observe today in the Middle East from the West is still seen as a crusading effort. They have a long memory, and they teach this in their textbooks. We don't. And, as Americans, we say things like, I just don't understand what they're doing over there. Do you understand? I mean, there's a long, long, long history here. We'll say more about that in a minute. But the best estimate is that over that 200-year period, that the Crusades are responsible for about 2 million deaths. And in that time period, it's massive. That's just a massive number. Number four, Europeans learned to colonize in the name of religious and state power with the Crusades. Because when the Crusades ended, where did they go? Africa, eventually North America, Central America, South America, and particularly the Spaniards by this time, who did not operate in the Crusades, but learned how. The Spaniards in particular, they had this wasn't in my notes, but they had something called the requirement when the Spanish showed up in Mexico, what is now Mexico. And it was one paragraph that basically said, "We beseech you in the name of God and in the name of the King that you surrender your lands and submit to Christianity and bow the knee to the king, pay the taxes, and if you don't, we're going to kill you all." That was what the conquistadors arrived with when they came to this. Where did they learn that? From the Crusaders. So it's a transfer in many ways. Number 5, the long process of eroding papal power. In the 1200s, the Pope is at his zenith. And if you had told him in 200 more years, you're going to lose your grip on Europe, the nation states coming, reformers are coming, they would have laughed at you. They had no idea the long-lasting effect that the Crusades had on the Catholic Church still to this day. 6, the decimation of the Eastern Church and the rise of the Ottoman Empire. Direct result of the Crusades. The Byzantines could never marshal an army again after the Crusades in any kind of defense. And the Turks completely took Constantinople, became Istanbul. And while it is still the seat of the Eastern Church, it would never be an empire again. And then 7, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and something called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Let's go to that next slide and we'll talk about that real quick. I laid these two alongside you because I want you to see them. Look at them for a minute. How they are very similar, separated by almost 1,000 years. So, John was mentioning this the other day. The Ottoman Empire is collapsing. The First World War erupts. British Petroleum discovers oil in the Middle East all at the same time. And a guy named Mark Sykes represented Great Britain. Francis Picot represented the French. And in 1908, they drew these lines. And they said, when we get our opportunity and the Ottomans collapse, is apparent that it's going to happen, and they could not foresee that the World War was going to take the direction it did. Between 1908 to 1916, they drew these lines up and said, when the wars are over, this is what's going to happen. Now you see the red zone there is under direct British control, which is Iraq. And the B zone under British influence, all the way from Saudi Arabia in the desert. International zone is Palestine proper. A zone, Syria, and all the way up. And it matches almost exactly Odessa, Antioch, Tripoli, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Yes. A Brit right there in the, waging war. And the promise had been made by both the British and the French governments that when the Ottomans collapse, that the Jews would get a nation state of their own, the Palestinians would get a nation state of their own, and the Kurds in Iraq would get a nation state in Turkey of their own. And then secretly, this map was drawn, and when the war was over, World War I was over, those promises were reneged upon. And British Petroleum moved in, and what we have today in the Middle East is a direct result of this map being drawn in 1916. It would be followed by the Balfour Declaration, which was the British declaration that we will defend to the death the right for the Israeli people to have a nation. So they went back to that promise. They did not go back to the Palestinian or the Kurdish promise. So, you remember over 20 years ago now, or maybe, no, help me, Chris, which war was it? Was it when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in 91? And there was all this talk about the Kurdish rebellion in the north of Iraq? That map. Promises were made to the Kurds 100 years ago that when the Ottomans collapse, we will carve out a part of Iraq for you to have your own nation state. And it never happened. So tread lightly. I just can't abide Well, I can't hardly abide social media anyway. But I can't hardly abide flippant things that are said on social media that you have to take all this into account. These are long, brooding grudges that nobody in our lifetime is going to solve. We can make it worse, but we're not going to solve it because there's just been too much underhanded. And they view this as further colonization. The lines are drawn literally where the Crusaders drew them in 1099. Questions? Why? Why didn't they keep their promises? Oil, petroleum. That's the only answer. And it wasn't a big deal to make promises to them in 1908, 1916 when oil's discovered. I mean, the wealth was unimaginable and has been unimaginable. That Western countries, and I'm not on a soapbox, but the amount of wealth that Western countries have pulled from the soil of the Middle East from the crusading periods until now is incalculable. And, I suppose they're justified in a lot of their anger. I mean, think about we proud Americans. If that happened to us, what we would do. We would burn the world down. Right? Right? So it's so complicated. And then that connects directly to all the Israeli conflicts that are going on as well. It's directly related, Alex. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It was gold and silver and the taxes of, if you want to visit this place, it was a toll road from Europe all the way to the Holy Land. Literally. You pass into this city, pay the tax. Into the next one, pay the tax. Pay the next one. That's right. Yeah. Pay the tax. And paying one or two along the way is fine, but every time you cross a border, and then every time you go to the church, some holy site, another tax, another tithe. I mean, when Saladin, here's an example. When Saladin retook Jerusalem, Pope Gregory instituted a Saladin tax on all the nobles of Europe. 10% tithe on top of the tithe. As a way of extracting wealth, and also as a way of saying, if you want this to go away, then you got to go get rid of him. It's just so filthy. Right. Yep, pilgrimages, and it's on the great, Jerusalem and Israel's on the great trading highway. It was the launching point into Persia, and the spice trail of the Far East, and the grain belt of Egypt. So that was, it's not just that it's a holy site. Strategically, there's not a more gateway country in the world than right there. I mean, you can see it today to avoid the Houthi rebels. Tankers are going all the way outside the Red Sea, and around Africa because it's too dangerous to travel in and out of there. So imagine that in Middle Age times as well. The extortion, the wealth. The Templars literally create the European banking system during this time, where they say, "Oh, don't travel to Jerusalem with your money. Put it in one of our banks, and we'll give you a note that when you arrive there, you can get it." That's how the modern banking system, as we know it, is an invention of the Knights Templars. Gary? No, I don't. I think you have to get the Protestant Reformation at some point, because as nation states and education rises and individuality finally emerges, that you get the mindset of the Reformation, that we're mad as hell and we're not going to take it anymore, kind of a thing, But in the late 1200s, when the popes were still calling for crusades, and European mothers and fathers and kings and nobles said, we're not giving you our children anymore. Right there is a change. It's a drastic shift where it wasn't just blind allegiance anymore. And it opens a door for maybe we can think differently about these things. Maybe what we're being promised. Well, the church sure is getting rich, but everything we've been promised hasn't emerged. And don't, you're just throwing rocks at that Roman Catholics again. No. Every oppressive system of power does this. And it doesn't matter if it's the Roman Catholic Church or if it's Geneva under John Calvin years later, or if it's an Islamic caliphate or anywhere. Whenever someone says, I am speaking for God, run for your life. Right? God told me. I mean, I've had some religious experiences, and I hope you've had some spiritual experiences. But no experience I've ever had has empowered me to say, thus is God's will for you. I'm way too Protestant for that. I probably wouldn't have survived. I would have been they would have just burnt me at the stake pretty quick, I think. Other questions? Thank you for your patience tonight. It's a bloody mess to get through this. Next week, here I stand. We'll get to the Protestant Reformation, and for many of us, that's our roots. There's some good cradle Catholics in here, I know, but this is the roots that has the most influence on North America today. Thanks, y'all.